In 1956, the British, French and Israelis tried to seize the Suez Canal, but due to diplomatic pressure, they were forced to retreat. In the aftermath of this, Eisenhower promised to grant aid to Middle Eastern nations opposed to the USSR. This was the Eisenhower Doctrine, and it demonstrated that he was prepared to jeopardize relations with NATO members and Israel in order to defend Nasser's Egypt. However, he never really gained any favors for this. The Soviets got most of the credit, even though Khrushchev later admitted his threats of war were empty. Still, he was praised as a defender against imperialism, even though Nasser supposedly, privately, expressed gratitude to the Americans. At the same time, the whole situation demonstrated to the world that the Western European nations were now reliant on the Americans, especially against Soviet nuclear threats. France and West Germany in particular were angry with how the Americans seemingly caved into the Soviets, and this helped push them towards forming closer ties, and eventually the European Economic Community. Charles de Gaulle even felt betrayed by the British, and in order to pave their own path, they began to develop their own nuclear weapons, while also secretly helping their Israeli allies on their own plans. In Britain, Anthony Eden was forced to resign, and his replacement, Harold Macmillan, tried to repair relations with the Americans. He also seemingly saw the writing on the wall now when it came to decolonization, and gave a famous speech saying of Africa, "The wind of change is blowing through this continent." In fact, almost immediately, Ghana would be granted their independence, and much of the continent then followed. The Israelis, on the other hand, had once again beaten the Egyptians and forced them to reopen the Straits of Tiran. However, this set off a wave of anti-Semitism in Egypt, as Nasser arrested many Jews and stripped them of their Egyptian citizenship. Half of their population, or 25,000 people, left the country with just a suitcase, while the Egyptian government seized the rest of their property. Israel also continued to occupy the Sinai for a while, and to counter this, Nasser found an ally in Saudi Arabia. United, they needed to get the Israelis to withdraw, and to do that they needed to pressure the Americans. King Saud even debated cancelling American access to using Dhahran Airport. So the Saudis were still a vital ally to the Americans, not just for their oil, but also as an influential anti-Soviet nation in the region. However, they were now cooperating more and more with possible Soviet allies in Syria and Egypt. For instance, they began to send aid to Jordan to strengthen their own potential bloc, while also engaging with Nasser and al-Quwatli of Syria. Saud, though, also agreed to accept American aid in exchange for diplomatic neutrality in the Cold War. Plus, the Americans also agreed to pressure the Israelis to leave the Sinai in order to cement this alliance. So, Sinai and Gaza were given back to the Egyptians. Saud also agreed to introduce the Eisenhower Doctrine to the Islamic nations, and this marked a huge shift in Saudi-Egyptian relations. The Saudis watched on as Nasser heavily propagandized his supposed victory, putting him at the center of the Islamic world. Plus, he allowed Soviet ships to pass through the canal, and now there was a risk of communist forces building up near Saudi Arabia. More than that though, Nasser was promoting anti-monarchist groups across the region, and it was discovered that there was even a Saudi version of the Free Officers movement tied to Nasser. So that year Saud flew to Baghdad and met with King Faisal, ending decades of hostility between these royal houses, and forming a new bloc of nations. Nasser's plans suffered more setbacks as his ally in Jordan, Suleiman Nabulsi, didn't stay in power for long. He had tried to establish links with the Soviet Union, but King Hussein demanded all communist papers should be closed down. The king also sent his own diplomats to foreign countries, leading Nabulsi to threaten to resign and take to the streets. Pan-Arab officers in support of Nabulsi then began positioning themselves on the road to Amman. Hussein, believing a coup was imminent, ordered them back to their bases, but leftists and Nasserites continued to protest in the streets. Nabulsi meanwhile attended a conference demanding Jordan enter into a union with Egypt. So Hussein declared martial law and arrested Nabulsi, with reportedly backing from the Saudis, who had sent in troops to secure his rule. The Saudis also sent millions of dollars to the country to try and end their dependence on the British. However, to further complicate matters, this was part of an agreement they made with the Egyptians and Syrians, who also wanted to rid British influence from the country. So it was pretty common these countries would work alongside one another and then against one another. In Syria though, events nearly led to a war between Turkey and the Soviet Union, and it tested the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Syrians had been requesting Soviet assistance for some time, worrying their neighbours and the Americans, so much so that many believed a communist takeover was imminent, or even had already taken place. Part of the reason behind this was the appointment of a communist sympathizer, Colonel al-Bizri, as head of the armed forces. Plus, all of the American diplomats were expelled. In September, Dulles, the American Secretary of State, declared that Syria would become a communist nation if nothing is done within 60 days. Some within London and Washington looked at the possibility of removing President Kouatly despite the failures of the Suez Crisis. Yet this time, they did have the support of many Muslim leaders in Iraq, Turkey and Jordan. The Israelis made threats of intervention before, while Kermit Roosevelt, who had long worked in the Islamic world, began to cooperate with groups within Syria. Ideally, they hoped to spark border clashes with Iraq, Turkey and Jordan, and thus allowing all the countries to move in. Former leaders or the Druze population could well have been used to start insurrections within the country, but it was determined Iraq didn't have the army to achieve much, so nothing happened. Instead, the Turks, fearing Soviet encirclement, just moved troops to the border. This in turn prompted Nasser to dispatch a small, largely ceremonial force to Syria to expand his own influence. Throughout all of this, Kouatly was more of an observer, being pulled in different directions by competing factions. Like Michael Aflaq, the Christian leader of the Baathists, had begun to criticize the Saudis for aligning with the Iraqis, while the Al Nasir newspaper accused them of interfering in Syrian affairs. The Saudis, in response, withdrew their ambassadors and froze Syrian assets. This came as a shock to al-Kouatly, who for years had been close to the Saudis, but now it was obvious that Nasserism, or at least Baathism, was becoming a more dominant force in the country. The Saudis, though, also seemed to be somewhat unaware or unwilling to accept recent developments. As their foreign minister reported, Arabs could not possibly be communists. Therefore, nobody should be concerned about recent events in Syria. But the Turks just continued to build up troops on the border. Here, Jalal Bayar was still in charge, and he continued turning Turkey more towards the west. In fact, he even said, "We hope that in 30 years, this blessed nation with its 50 million strong population will be a little America." Finally though, Khrushchev came to the aid of Syria and said the Turks should not do that. They are very weak. Turkey would not last one day in case of war. Turkey therefore stood down, and Khrushchev gained another victory in the Arab world. However, while the world had been focused on Syria and the Suez, elsewhere wars and rebellions were breaking out. Like in Oman, where yet again the Imam of the interior lands was challenging the Sultan of Muscat. The Sultan was technically independent but still relied on the British for defence, as he only had a small personal force of mainly Baluchi soldiers. Keep in mind, they still owned Gwadar in Pakistan at this time. He had signed away a number of oil concessions to the British, and with this wealth, Sultan Said bin Taimur hoped to march onto the Imam's territory and unite the country. The British, on the other hand, had another issue. If they were going to access oil in the interior of Oman, should they negotiate with the Sultan or the Imam? So, to end this problem, they just began to support the Sultan's plans. Fortunately for both of them, the Imam's territory was further divided into the lands of the Hanawis and the Kafiris, who had an age-old rivalry. The Sultan began using British aid money to bribe members of the Kafiris over to his side. Then, back in 1954, an opportunity presented itself, as Imam al-Khalili died, and Ghalib al-Hanai was elected as the new leader. The Sultan quickly signed away rights of exploration to oil prospectors within the Imam's territory, and moved in troops to occupy the Imam's capital. This move further divided the Arab world, as the Imam's brother tried to rally support in both Riyadh and Cairo. Both nations were usually quite keen to expand their influence. However, he only managed to equip around 300 fighters. He returned in 1957, starting the Jebel Akhdar War. The rebels cut off the Sultan's supply lines, forcing him to retreat. Britain therefore decided to step in and help the Sultan. Controversially, the RAF deliberately bombed irrigation systems and crops to deprive both the troops and civilians of water and food. They also stopped journalists from entering the country in order to keep a remarkably low profile of the war, especially in a post-Suez world. Many in government even questioned the legality of such a campaign and the broader goals in backing such an unpopular leader. Nevertheless, they continued to chase the Imam's forces up to the Jebel Akhdar mountain range, where they were safe for a while. The Imam meanwhile tried to get support from the UN and Arab League, but they declared that this was a civil war and not an act of British aggression, so the stalemate would continue for another couple years. In the meantime, the British helped facilitate a deal between Pakistan and Oman for the sale of Gwadar for a relatively low sum, but this though ended the Omani colonial empire. The following year, in 1959, the British made their final move against the Imam. The SAS helped chase him out of the country into Saudi Arabia, finally ending the war. However, British involvement in the conflict isolated Oman, as many saw the Sultan as a puppet of the West and an obstacle to Arab unity. Meanwhile, over in North Africa, the Algerian War was continuing to grow more violent, and French actions were condemned internationally. For instance, in late 1956, they intercepted a Moroccan plane carrying many of the FLN leadership, including Ahmed Ben Bella and Mohamed Boudiaf. This stopped them from attending a conference, which was also attended by Habib Bourguiba of Tunisia and Mohammed V of Morocco, and it of course crippled their leadership. Also, as this was a Moroccan plane, it also panicked Mohammed V and led to anti-French protests in his country. There was also the case of Maurice Audin, an Algerian communist who was arrested in his home and then disappeared. Although this was just one of many examples, this case made the news and highlighted the use of torture and killings to many back home in France. In fact, the French military argued that these prisoners were not POWs and therefore the Geneva Convention did not apply. So hundreds of these prisoners were killed on death flights, being thrown out of helicopters. Many prisoners were deprived of sleep and food, female inmates like Jamila Boubacha were assaulted, and some interrogation methods were particularly cruel. In some cases, they would tie prisoners up and put them in water and then electrocute them. So to bring further attention to the conflict, the FLN decided to begin attacking major cities. They called the people to strike in Algiers and then sent in women to set off bombs, while their soldiers carried out sporadic shootings. General Jacques Massu responded by sending in troops to break up the strikes, but once again, this was a propaganda victory for the FLN. Out in the countryside, they continued the guerrilla war, often attacking the Pied Noir, or those they deemed to be sympathizers. Much of this, though, was essentially a campaign of terror, as they were carrying out brutal crimes and torturing people themselves, including, in some cases, castrating them. Learning from Mao once they had carried out these attacks, they merged back in with the civilian population, and through this they began to control areas around Kabylie and in the mountains outside the major cities. However, their commanders often vied for power, and some officers used their new power to exploit the local population or to contend with old rivals. All of this means they still had to use threats and coercion to bolster their forces. The Pied Noir and much of the French army believed that the government in Paris, which was constantly changing, was largely undermining the war effort, especially as now the Battle of Algiers was fully underway. Bombs were being detonated everywhere, shootings were commonplace, and the city was largely divided into two camps. The French again tried to restore order through torture and the likes, but this resulted in international condemnation. However, again the FLN proved to be equally brutal, even turning on themselves for a while, as the French were able to infiltrate their ranks with informants. It was reported that this resulted in a frenzy of throat-cutting and disemboweling broke out among confused and suspicious FLN cadres. Nationalist slaughtered nationalist. The French by this point still had around 400,000 troops in Algeria, over a third of which were Muslim Algerians that joined voluntarily. But still, despite their indiscriminate bombings and the likes, the army felt more needed to be done. So, under General Salan, they seized government buildings in Algiers and demanded de Gaulle be brought back into power. In late May 1958, they even sent paratroopers from Algeria to Corsica, and from here they planned on marching on Paris if their demands were not met, or they felt like the communists could make a move for power. This nearly threw France into a civil war, so most of the politicians agreed to their demands, and de Gaulle created a new republic, with his position being given more powers. He then quickly flew to Constantine and gave a speech highlighting a new plan to end the war in Algiers. In essence, he would pour money into the country, building schools, developing the economy, and employing hundreds of thousands, and therefore drag Algerians away from the FLN. Some of his targets were actually met as they built homes for 1 million people, but elsewhere they fell short. Like, although 400 factories were constructed, they only created around 30,000 jobs, far short of their goal of 400,000, so the war continued. Across the border, the French continued to occupy sections of Tunisia to conduct the war. In May 1957, they actually clashed with Tunisian troops along the border, as thousands of Algerian refugees were let in. Bourguiba was of course angered by this and demanded their withdrawal, however compromised and allowed the French to remain only in the city of Bizerte. At the same time, another war would begin in Ifni and Cape Juby in Spanish West Africa. Now, the Spanish had already agreed to hand over most of their lands in northern Morocco, but Mohammed V was determined to reclaim historic Moroccan land and funded Berber rebels to do so. When demonstrations turned violent in 1957, Franco sent troops south, prompting the Moroccans to also move in their army and encircle Ifni. They cut communication lines to the city and then, in November, moved in. Although they stormed many bases, they were unable to take the city and focused on ambushing Spanish patrols instead. However, in early 1958, the Spanish were once again saved by the French, who were worried about the violence spilling over into Mauritania. They helped push the Moroccans back, but still, in April 58, the Spanish agreed to make peace and hand over Cape Juby. But they were able to keep hold of city Ifni and what is today Western Sahara. But no sooner was this conflict over than the Rif tribes once again rebelled, again demanding the expulsion of foreigners and also the return of their old leader El Krim. Their lands produced a great deal of cannabis at this point, which provided funding for their liberation army, an army which continued to fight for the independence of all Moroccan lands and refused to recognize any past agreements until then. They therefore continued clashing with European armies and, crucially, even Moroccan. While in the newly independent nation, many different factions vied for power, including the king, the Liberation Army, and the dominant political party, Istiklal. First, though, it should be said that the new nation did achieve quite a lot in a short space of time. They united the economies and currencies of Old French Morocco, Spanish Morocco, and the Tangier International Zone. Then Operation Plough united inefficient farmland into larger units. Through this and other reforms, they were finally able to begin to centralize the country. But of course, a newly independent nation did face problems. As the king himself said of the elections of 1958, we faced a complete vacuum. No electoral law, no voters list, no definite districts. And although the Istiklal Party was united in their quest for independence, now their conflicting social and economic plans caused further rifts. Initially an independent, Mberek Bekay took the position of Prime Minister until the election, which Istiklal won. Influential nationalist Ahmed Belefrej took over, but even he wouldn't last long. The more left-wing elements of the party began to splinter off, and the riots in the north challenged their authority. The royal army in fact lost a number of early battles against the Rif, and the Crown Prince's plane was shot down. Confident of their success, the Rifian rebels presented 18 demands to the Sultan, including tax reduction and job creation. This revolt now was largely targeted against the Istiklal Party, and in late October 58, some of their party officers were seized. In the chaos, Crown Prince Hassan saw an opportunity to assert royal power in the country. He sent a huge army north to crush the rebels and force many to flee to Europe. On top of that, the short period of liberal policies led to the creation of trade unions and, ultimately, strikes. Well, the king used this, the rebellion, and the splits in the Istiklal Party to take full power just before his death. 1958, though, proved to be one of the most important years in Middle Eastern history, as, in the aftermath of the Syrian crisis, Nasser and al-Quwatli decided to unite their nations, fearing a communist takeover. Inside Syria, the Communist Party had continued to grow, the Baathists demanded a union, the Prime Minister, al-Azam, still opposed Nasser, believing that the Egyptians would end Syria's free market economy. However, politically, he remained an ally of the Soviets. The Prime Minister, though, was just ignored when other party leaders sent a delegation to meet Nasser. This included Akram al-Harani, the head of the Arab Socialist Party, and Salah al-Din al-Battar from the Baathists. They made a deal with Nasser, agreeing to unite their countries after a plebiscite, which al-Azam called a coup. The plebiscite, though, went ahead in February, with both Syrians and Egyptians voting for a union, the United Arab Republic. This would be led by Nasser, who quickly cracked down on Syrian communists, but this didn't anger the Soviets, as they were more interested in global influence rather than hardline doctrinal allegiances. Nasser also filled much of the government in Syria with Egyptians and put Egyptian officers in control of Syrian forces. He then nationalized most of the country's industry and banks and capped how much land somebody could own, angering many in the elite. These policies would then lead to quick divisions. But for now, Egypt was growing thanks to the Union, and with no freedom of the press, pro-Nasser propaganda continued to spread. And then they found a new member in Yemen, who had long been a rival of the Saudis and the British. Yemen, though, would remain independent, but they signed an alliance to form the United Arab States. Ahmed bin Yahya of Yemen was also growing worried about British plans to divide southern Yemen into a federation of states, which could well jeopardize his plans for unification. After all, the Imam was the head of the Shia Zaydis, and much of the south was Sunni, so a successful state in the south could counter any of his advances. He therefore began to support sectarian violence across the border in the late 50s, which resulted in the death of 1,000 people, and of course these hostilities with Britain pulled Yemen closer to Nasser. This union also obviously panicked nearby countries, especially the Hashemite monarchs in Iraq and Jordan, so they too decided to unite and form the United Arab Federation. From here, Faisal and Hussein could well have brought in other nearby kingdoms like Kuwait, however, it would all collapse very quickly. Both unions began to move troops to the borders, but inside the Iraqi army was Abdul Karim Qasim. He opposed all ideas of pan-Arabism, pan-Turkism, Kurdish nationalism, and anything that would undermine the Iraqi state. He saw the Iraqi culture as unique, and the Iraqi people as inheritors of ancient civilizations like the Babylonians and the Assyrians. On top of that, he believed a secular state would unite the religious groups of the nation, and he was one of the first to put forward the idea that Kuwait and Khuzestan were both integral parts of Iraq. However, he copied from Nasser and led the Free Officers Movement of Iraq. In July 1958, as troops were moving across the country, he decided to move his allies into Baghdad and take control of the city. They then seized the royal palace and killed the king, Prime Minister Nouri al-Said, and the old regent Abd al-Ilah. In the case of the regent, his body was paraded through the streets in front of crowds. This coup came as a shock to nearly everyone, as nobody really understood what was happening. Even the Americans believed that it could have been a pro-Nasser coup initially, while inside Iraq, the country was thrown into chaos. As Qasim took full power with his allies, the New York Times reported there were rival groups competing for control, cross-currents of communism, Arab and Iraqi nationalism, Westernism, and the positive neutrality of President Gamal Abdel Nasser of the United Arab Republic have been affecting the country. So to unite the country, a three-man council was created to share the role of presidency. A cabinet was also formed to include a couple representatives from the communists, Ba'athist parties and the likes. Qasim, however, would quickly pull Iraq out of the Baghdad Pact and begin to make approaches to the Soviet Union. Many called on him to join the United Arab Republic, but to counter them, he organized huge demonstrations in Mosul, possibly numbering 200,000. Most of these people were communists. As they began to clash with pan-Arab nationalists in the streets, Colonel Shawaf, who was in charge of troops in Mosul, began to grow worried. He saw this as a possible communist takeover and decided to put them down, executing around 300 communists, and then he called for a coup of his own. He gained the support of tribesmen like the Shamar, who were opposed to any communist reforms, while he sent planes to try and bomb Baghdad, but this achieved nothing. Qasim responded by bombing Shawaf's position, and then Shawaf was betrayed and killed by one of his own men. His body, like before, was then paraded through the streets, as the city descended into anarchy. Bedouin tribesmen pillaged houses, communists and nationalists continued fighting, Kurdish tribes that supported Qasim's plans on unity arrived to fight back the Bedouin. In fact, they even killed Sheikh Ahmed Ajil, the leader of the Shamar, and again paraded his body through the streets. After a few days, Qasim was able to restore order and accused Nasser of being behind the coup attempt. Qasim, though, had largely lost control of the situation, as communists began to purge the army and started more violence in Kirkuk. Yet Qasim is a complex figure in Iraqi history, as he did introduce huge land reforms and broke up much of the feudal structure of the countryside. He promoted women's rights and even called Kurdistan one of the two nations of Iraq, seemingly ready to grant them autonomy. The Kurds, I should say, had never given up ambitions for an independent state. For example, during World War II, they contacted Nazi agents in Istanbul, hoping to secure weapons for a rebellion led by Sheikh Mahmud. They were supposed to take over British oil fields, but Operation Mammoth was a failure as the agents were arrested. Qasim, though, still welcomed longtime Kurdish nationalist Mustafa Barzani back into the country. This would, in theory, unite the nation, but, like when the British invited him back, he would soon lead a rebellion again. Qasim would also continue to antagonize pretty much all of his neighbours by refusing to join Nasser on one hand and also claiming lands in Iran and all of Kuwait. His seizure of power also left the Jordanians isolated. They quickly asked for Western help to stop a similar revolution. The British sent 4,000 troops to the country, while America agreed to send $50 million a year to prop up their economy. Also stuck in the middle of all of this was Camille Chamoun of Lebanon. As Time reported, it was the most stable of all Arab countries, with sturdier traditions of literacy, representative government, religious tolerance and international trade than any of its neighbours. But the announcement of the Syrian-Egyptian Union has had an explosive effect among the half of Lebanon's population who are Muslims. In a republic whose Christian Arabs dominate business life, and whose Christian president Camille Chamoun, a Roman Catholic of Maronite rite, has accepted the Eisenhower Doctrine, Muslims have become increasingly dominated by a persecution complex. Many Muslims began to make a trip to Damascus as almost a sign of defiancy. And there, on a visit, Nasser said, "As I see my brothers and sisters from Lebanon standing side by side, with their brothers from the region of Syria and the region of Egypt, I feel I am witnessing the return of matters to their natural course. The artificial boundaries that have been put between Arab countries by the imperialists cannot estrange us." Chamoun tried to change the constitution to run for a second term, but this prompted violence in the streets. Even his residence was shot at. So he banned all demonstrations and removed all posters of Nasser in the streets. Yet the violence continued to spread as weapons began to pour across the borders to militants, and the Christians killed a newspaper editor critical of Chamoun. So just like in Jordan, the Lebanese called upon the British and Americans to send troops to help stabilize the situation. The Americans, trying to apply the Eisenhower Doctrine, then declared that they would intervene if the country was threatened by communism. As part of Operation Blue Bat, thousands of American troops secured the ports and airports around the capital. All the while, the country still divided power between the different religions. The Sunni Muslim Prime Minister at this time was Sami Saleh, while the Shia Speaker of the House was Adel Osseran. He declared, "Lebanon will march with the Arab caravan, and anyone who thinks of working for interests other than those of the Arabs will have no room in Lebanon." The government was therefore divided and working towards different goals. So to secure their control, the Christians also asked the UN to intervene, and an observation group prevented the United Arab Republic from shipping arms into the country. The Americans, however, convinced Chamoun not to seek a second term, and instead allow Fouad Shahab to take over. He had previously served in the French army, but was now seen as a moderate option and more impartial than its predecessor. He quickly made a deal with Nasser, promising that Lebanon would not be used as a base against the United Arab Republic, and in return, Nasser promised to stop arming the militants, ending this, the Lebanon crisis. Coups and regime change, however, would not stop and would spread over into Turkey. Here, Prime Minister Menderes, as I've mentioned before, has been accused of being responsible for the Istanbul pogroms, while also joining NATO alongside Greece. And his policies continued to be often contradictory. For instance, he was opposed to the CHP and promoted Islam again in the country, like he opened many mosques and lifted the ban on Qurans in school. But also he celebrated Ataturk and internationally continued to be pro-Western. He even said of the Arabs, it was time they recognized Israel's right to survive. This left them completely isolated, as Nasser said, Turkey, because of its Israeli policy, is disliked in the Arab world. Also, while promoting a liberal economy and more private enterprise, politically he began to clamp down on free speech and other freedoms. Their economic policies, though, had left the country even poorer, as the lira was devalued more than 3 times. This, along with the threats to Kemalist principles like secularism, turned many against the ruling Democratic Party. This is when Ismet Inonu began to campaign once again, looking to take power. However, during his campaign he was attacked in a couple of cities and his train was stopped by the authorities. The Democratic Party then accused the CHP of planning a rebellion, so in 1960 they established a commission of inquiries to prosecute them, essentially undermining the separation of powers. Menderes justified this by revealing plans he had discovered involving 9 officers that had formed a secret society of sorts and were poised to strike. However, in 1960, students took to the streets in Istanbul against this move to dictatorship. The police shot at the crowds, but the protest continued and even spread to Ankara, forcing the government to call in the army. But the students and the soldiers embraced one another, and this highlights something pretty unique to Turkey. Here, many in the army see themselves not necessarily as defenders of the government, but rather defenders of Kemalism and secularism. They would therefore act against any government that threatens these ideas. So when martial law was declared, the army did very little, and more protests were organised at 5 PM on the 5th of May, hence the name the 555K protests. They actually encountered Celal Bayar and Menderes and cursed at them. Allegedly, in one confrontation, Menderes asked the students what they wanted. One student grabbed him and demanded freedom, and Menderes responded saying, "You're holding onto the collar of the Prime Minister. Is there any greater freedom than that?" But the protests continued to spread, and Menderes realised he needed to make a drastic change. But there was no great hope of improving the economy, as US aid, which was then sent as part of the Truman Doctrine, was running out. He therefore was about to make a complete 180 and travel to the Soviet Union to ask for their help. This angered a number of people, including Alparslan Türkeş. He had previously been sentenced alongside Nihal Atsiz for his far-right ideas about Turkism. He was soon released, but his right-wing views and goals of uniting Turkic people meant he was an ardent anti-communist. As such, he spent some time training in the United States and Germany. In fact, he, like future leaders of Turkey, had ties to the CIA and were part of a much larger operation known as Gladio. In essence, the Americans feared a Soviet invasion of Greece, Turkey, Italy and the likes. So they began to train guerrilla fighters to stay and disrupt the Soviets from behind the front lines. However, to find allies in this, they needed to turn to the far right. For instance, there was Ruzi Nazar, who was an Uzbek soldier that fought alongside the Nazis, hoping to create a Turkic state. The leader of the whole Turkish branch of this organization was Kenan Evren, who had served with the Americans in Korea, and he would later become the president of Turkey. The commander of all Turkish forces, however, was Cemal Gürsel. He had resigned in early May, sending a farewell message to his troops saying, "When a political storm is blowing over the country, know how to protect yourselves from this nefarious atmosphere. Keep out of the politics at any cost." This, however, was ignored, and low-ranking officers planned a coup. They managed to gain the support of some higher generals, like Major General Cemal Mandanoglu, and the Chief of Logistics and First Army Commander, Fahri Özdilek. In the case of Mandanoglu, he was only given 24 hours to respond, and allegedly said, "Damn, is masculinity dead? I agree to join your organization." They then all decided to make their move on the 27th of May, late in the night. Tanks rolled out into the streets, opponents were interned, and even Celal Bayar was detained in Çankaya Mansion. Menderes, on the other hand, was captured on the road to Konya. Türkeş then announced over the radio the success of the coup, but still the general of the Third Army threatened to march against the coup leaders unless they were led by a more senior commander than himself. So the coup leaders flew out Cemal Gürsel, who had just resigned. He had been completely unaware of the coup, but now he was made the head of a 38-man junta which took over the country. Together they banned demonstrations, many publications, restricted phone calls and more. Yet they justified their actions, saying that they were defending freedoms and rights. They then brought members of the old government to trial, accusing them of violating the constitution, corruption and a lot of killings. For instance, Celal Bayar was put in prison for, among other things, accepting gifts from the King of Afghanistan, while Menderes and others were convicted of inciting the anti-Greek pogroms, including setting off the bomb in Thessaloniki. They were also accused of stopping Inonu's train as part of an assassination attempt, killing students during the demonstrations and more. And for this, Menderes was executed. The military junta, though, would quickly begin to break up, as initially the plan was to hand power back to the civilian government, but Turkes and many of the more right-wing coup leaders rejected this and split off. Cemal Gürsel, though, remained a pretty popular president, as he quickly brought in a new constitution, separating powers, granting freedom of speech and more. As such, he won the next election to stay on as president, and Inonu led a coalition of parties as prime minister. To repair the economy, they went back to state planning, and this period saw a number of advances. Like radio and television broadcasts first began to appear in far eastern cities like Erzurum, they opened an atomic reactor, they produced their first ever car, known as the Devrim, computers were first used, and the Ankara Agreement signed with the French and West Germans set the stages of Turkish integration into Europe and the newly formed EEC. This was also the period that saw many Turkish migrants arrive in Europe to assist in post-war industrial development. Relations also began to improve with the Soviets and their Islamic neighbours. Like, they signed the Regional Cooperation for Development with Iran and Pakistan. However, Cyprus remained a major problem. Menderes had previously told the Turkish Cypriots, "You should go to the foreign minister and request the status quo be prolonged, Cyprus to remain as a British colony," while the British didn't seem to favour a union with Greece or a partition. As such, ethnic violence continued. Both sides formed their own paramilitaries, like the Greek EOKA and the Turkish Black Gang. But then, in 1960, the British created the Republic of Cyprus with the intention that both communities would share power. However, because the Greeks made up 4/5 of the population, they would hold more power. Greece and Turkey sent troops to the island to defend their communities, while Archbishop Makarios, the first president, tried to make sweeping changes to the constitution in 1963. This would grant the Greeks further powers, or at least that's how it was perceived by the Turkish Cypriots and the Turkish government. Then the violence continued to spiral as bands of paramilitaries patrolled areas, shooting indiscriminately into crowds in villages like Ormafita. In many cases, the ethnic Turks were forced to leave, or like at Ayios Vasilios, some were killed and buried in a mass grave. By the end of the year, 360 Turks and 170 Greeks had been killed, and thousands had been forced to leave their homes, especially the Turks. The Greek Cypriots at the time also authored a controversial document known as the Akritos Plan, which the Turks called a blueprint for genocide. However, its true meaning, like anything to do with Greece and Turkey, has been disputed, and largely it just reneged on past agreements and looked at unifying with Greece. The Greeks, however, believed that they could do all of this in Cyprus because of further problems in Turkey. The group of hardline coup leaders that had left the National Unity Committee, known as the 14, continued to call for more radical action and the continuation of military rule. They were also worried about Inonu's coalition with the newly formed Justice Party, a party made up of many members of the old Democratic Party. So, under Talat Aydemir, the hardliners signed the October Protocol, declaring that they would intervene against the new constitution and civilian government. Future President Cevdet Sunay was made aware of these plans, as he was a general, but he revealed them to Inonu. To try and defuse the situation, the officers were then transferred to the east. Talat Aydemir, however, then gave a speech to officers, saying that Parliament is not working, and they moved onto the Grand National Assembly with tanks in February 1962. Many of the units called in to suppress the coup just joined in, and they took over the capital. Inonu and Gürsel found sanctuary within the Air Force, which had remained loyal, and made speeches over the radio to de-escalate the situation. Jets also flew over the coup leaders' bases as a warning, so when Aydemir was offered leniency, he took it and surrendered. However, Inonu, in keeping his promise to pardon the attempted coup leaders, weakened his own position, as many began to also demand the release of arrested Democratic Party members as well. So he just resigned soon after, and Aydemir never gave up his ambitions to establish military rule. In May 1963, he would again declare over the radio that a coup was underway, but most forces remained loyal to the government, and Aydemir was finally executed. This far-right element of Turkish society would continue to pose a threat to the government. Like Turkes would go on to form the Nationalist Movement Party and lead its armed wing, the Grey Wolves, which would kill hundreds of people. And it should also be said that the Kurds remained under martial law throughout all of this. In 1965, foreigners were finally able to visit the area, and one person described the city of Hakkari, where walking is the only means of transport. There seemed to be no indications whatever of political consciousness. The Haqqari Kurds are so isolated or uninterested that they do not even possess wireless radio sets. Many foreigners also criticized the repression of the Kurds, like Nehru of India, who said, "The Turks, who had only recently been fighting for their own freedom, crushed the Kurds who sought theirs." It is strange how defensive nationalism develops into an aggressive one, and a fight for freedom becomes one for domination over others. While over the border in Iraq, the Kurdish war would start again thanks to Mustafa Barzani. He became the head of the KDP and began to agitate once more for independence, when it became clear Qasim would not follow through on many of his promises of autonomy. Qasim tried to cripple his power by bolstering Barzani's tribal rivals, the Brajost and Zabari. These intertribal conflicts would then last until 1961, when Barzani emerged victorious, and then declared all Iraqi troops should be chased out of Kurdish lands. In September, the Iraqi Air Force bombed Kurdish villages and the army moved in. This, however, was only the start of a decades-long conflict, which I'll get back to, as 1961 proved to be yet another vital year in Middle Eastern history. For starters, south of Iraq, Kuwait had gained their full independence. Abdullah III had long been opposed to British influence and sought closer relations with his Arab neighbours. However, Qasim of Iraq almost immediately declared Kuwait should be part of his country, along with most of its oil. The Kuwaitis then had to turn back to the British for protection, and as part of Operation Vantage, the Royal Navy arrived and deterred an invasion. Meanwhile, to the west of Iraq, there would be another coup in Syria. Under Nasser's control, most political parties had been disbanded, even the Baathists, who had championed unity. Nasser did have his allies though, notably Abdel Hamid al-Sarraj, who the British called the Viceroy of Syria. However, he largely ran a ruthless campaign of suppression, backed up by a secret police. As one Syrian officer said, "Before Sarraj, Syria wasn't a bloody country despite all the coups. Sarraj used torture, police rule, killing, nail extraction to oppress Syrian people and officers. Syria became a terror school." Nasser's nationalization of banks and industries also caused a food shortage in the country, so the Egyptians began to seize grain and froze assets to deal with the situation. The regional government of Syria was also abolished, turning the country into an Egyptian province. This of course continued to worry the Syrian elites, who were set to lose almost everything. Nasser was pressured eventually to try and end Sarraj's worst excesses, and to do this he appointed him as vice president, thus bringing him to Cairo. In his place he sent Egyptian General Abdel Hakim Amir, who began to dismiss many of Sarraj's allies. Sarraj and Amir began to argue it out in crisis meetings, presenting an opportunity for coup planners to actually meet and plot. In late September 1961, a group of Syrian officers, who were angered at being placed under Egyptian control, then moved on Damascus and arrested both Amir and Sarraj. They then announced over the radio, "The army has taken steps to remove corruption and tyranny, and to restore the legitimate rights of the people." But they were initially open to negotiations, and entered into discussions with Nasser about reversing some of his more harsh policies. However, Nasser refused to budge, and sent a small force of paratroopers to Latakia. They though were completely surrounded, and Egypt could make no further moves as they shared no borders. By the end of the day, most Syrian units declared their support for the coup, and they played the Syrian national anthem over the radio, obviously showing their intent to form an independent government once more. Ma'mun al-Kuzbari was brought in to govern the new state. He was a longtime politician and cousin of one of the coup leaders, Haydar al-Kuzbari. Jordan and Turkey quickly recognized the new nation, while Nasser was forced to accept that his united Arab state had come to an end. He filled the airways once more with propaganda, calling the new Syrian government reactionaries and feudalists. And to some extent he was right, as the new government was largely filled with Syrian elites, like Nazim al-Qudsi, who won the first election. He quickly turned the country towards the west. President Kennedy welcomed him as a friend, he privatized industries again, and repaired relations with the remaining monarchies of the Middle East. This, however, angered many of the officers that had actually led the coup, like Abd al-Karim al-Nalawi. Although he favoured some degree of autonomy and advancement of Syrians in the armed forces, he was not opposed to Nasser's socialist reforms. So by this point, Syria was divided into a whole range of factions, from Nasserites to Baathists, to socialists to the SSMP seeking a greater Syria and more. Well, in this chaos, Nilawi got the support from a few officers in Damascus, moved onto Parliament in late March 1962, and quickly dissolved it. Many in the army were happy to see the civilian government challenged, but didn't want Nilawi to take power himself. The various factions met in Homs and decided that Nilawi should be exiled. Yet the Nasrites, under Jassam Alwan, saw an opportunity to strike, and, with Egyptian backing, raised the United Arab Republic flag in Aleppo. The majority of Baathists, however, stood by the Homs Agreement and helped the army regain control. Nilawi and Alan were exiled, Al-Qudsi was brought back, and they promised to hold a referendum on union with Egypt soon. Also, to appease many, nationalisation policies would be reintroduced. The Nasrites planned on launching another coup that summer, but it was discovered and suppressed, though there would soon be yet another coup. First though, over in Lebanon there were similar challenges, but here it came from the SSNP. Again, they were determined to seize power and form Greater Syria, and for this they made their move during the holidays, believing that it would be the best time to strike. However, they had little support, and Fuad Shahab was able to end the coup and exile or arrest the leaders. Yet with all of these coups, leaders began to accuse one another within the Arab League, further weakening relations and ending any real hope of unity. Yet, just before I finish on 1961, we should go over to North Africa, where the French were on the back foot. Like in Tunisia, they had been able to keep troops in Bizerte, but the Tunisians learned that the French were in fact expanding their base without authorization, so they blockaded the French inside their base, demanding they evacuate. The French sent in some paratroopers, and, backed up with tanks and jets, they moved into Bizerte itself. This, the Bizerte crisis, left hundreds of Tunisians dead, and the French remained in the country, but only temporarily. As in Algeria, it became apparent that there were only two options that remained for the French. Either they grant Algeria independence, something that was supported by the large French Communist Party, or they could grant real equality to the Algerian Muslims and incorporate the country fully into France. However, on this latter option, de Gaulle said, if we integrate them, if all the Arabs and Berbers of Algeria were considered French, how could they be prevented from settling in France, where the living standard is so much higher? In other words, he didn't want them to migrate to Paris. But there was another plan put forward to actually partition the country. Although different people put forward different proposals, in essence the French would take parts of the northwest, along with Muslims who are committed to our side and want to stay with us. All Muslims who prefer to live in an Algeria led by the FLN are transferred to the rest of Algeria. We maintain free access to the Sahara, which must become an autonomous territory. We could divide Algiers like Berlin or Jerusalem. As such, it was often referred to as a French Israel, and de Gaulle even discussed the plans with Ben-Gurion of Israel. He apparently warned de Gaulle, it will only work if you send other French settlers en masse, if they settle permanently and they enlist as soldiers to fight. However, de Gaulle was not a fan of this idea. As he said, we will turn the whole earth against us. The Third World will show solidarity with the Arabs. We will have created a new Israel. All hearts in the Arab world and Asia and Latin America will beat in unison with the Algerians. So, with no other option and facing further pressure from the UN and even NATO, de Gaulle issued a statement in 1959 hinting at the possibility of self-determination. The more radical elements of the Pied Noir began a small insurrection in Algiers in early 1960, setting up barricades around the city. De Gaulle, though, managed to convince the army to remain loyal, and the uprising ended. After this, however, the far-right secret army organisation was formed, made up of well-armed and well-trained veterans of the conflict. They began a coordinated campaign of bombings and assassinations of not just the FLN, but also pro-government Frenchmen. Nevertheless, de Gaulle pushed on and held a referendum on self-determination. Strangely, 75% of people in France voted in favour, while only 70% of Algerians did so. But regardless, it passed. Many Pied Noirs took to the streets in protest, but French soldiers massacred over 50 of them at Isly, demonstrating that the fight was now between Frenchmen and Frenchmen. As for the FLN, they had signed a ceasefire with the French as part of the Evian Accords, while independence talks began. However, it was agreed that the French would be allowed to keep bases in Algeria regardless. The secret army organisation, however, continued to plot. This group included many high-ranking officers, including Raoul Salan, and they decided to make their move in April 1961 and seize Algiers. De Gaulle once again appealed to the soldiers and civilians to oppose the putsch over the radio, saying, "I forbid any Frenchman, and first of all any soldier, to execute a single one of their orders. French women, French men, help me." To make matters even more urgent for de Gaulle, the French nuclear arsenal was poised for tests in the Sahara, and this could well have fallen into the hands of the putsch leaders. But many soldiers decided to listen to de Gaulle, and the putsch failed. Some French leaders began to accuse the CIA of being involved, however there's no real evidence of this. Instead, this accusation seems to have been more of a Soviet attempt to drive a wedge between France and America. But really, France was now receiving condemnation for their actions even back home. Like in 1961 in Paris, they fired at Algerian protesters, killing dozens, possibly a couple hundred. In 1962, the secret army organization tried to break the ceasefire by setting off bombs. In some months, as many as 120 a day, and infamously attacking the university. They were now trying to stop another referendum on independence, but they failed, and 90% of French and Algerians voted in favour. With independence imminent, over 1.4 million people fled. This was essentially all of the Pied Noir and Jewish communities. And crucially, there was also movement on the Algerian side as well. The leadership of their entire movement was remarkably complicated and divided. In fact, many nationalist leaders were still in exile. Well, the French had made deals with a provisional government known as the GPRA. This was headed by the more moderate Ferhat Abbas and later Ben Youssef Benkada. They were poised to take power and lead the country, but in July, Ahmed Ben Bella returned from exile as the leader of the FLN. He gradually took over the West and gained the support of even Ferhat Abbas, who had been ousted by Benkada. However, this conflict could well demonstrate further divisions in the country. Ben Bella, for instance, had a base in Tlemcen and a following of Arabs, while pushing for a military dictatorship and a socialist economy. Benkada, on the other hand, had set up a base in Berber territory and was more Western in his outlook. The two sides then clashed, but Ben Bella quickly gained the upper hand and he moved into Algiers. He took the title of Prime Minister, and Ferhat Abbas was made president of the new country of Algeria.